Good morning, friends. It's really good to be with you again today. Be with you from a wet Charlotte. Um, Spring has sprung in many ways, and so we're enjoying a nice rainy morning. It's I was reflecting on my drive back to Charlotte last weekend, just how appreciative and humble it was to receive your warm welcome last week. So many of you stopped me in the fellowship hall, in the hallways coming and going, and shared your own stories about how trauma has impacted you or your families um, recently, or as maybe even a generation ago. And so to continue to hear these stories, it really meant a lot to me that you trusted me with your story. So thank you for that. And I look forward to more opportunities to hearing from you and getting to know you, um, and where this is hitting you all. So as I stated last week, Lent is a season of traumatized people. It's a season of waiting for Passion Week, waiting for the cross, and then wondering on that Holy Saturday if Sunday is even going to come, if the things that we have been praying for, the things we've been hoping for, are going to happen. So we read these documents now in 2025, and we're reminded of the post-traumatic reality of the New Testament. Traumatized apostles and disciples writing about the new reality we are living within. So last week we did a little bit on what we talk about when we talk about trauma. Today we're going to shift a little bit to what does it mean to be trauma informed, and specifically, what does it mean to be a trauma informed church? When I see you in person next week, we'll do a little bit on moral injury and kind of how the trauma conversation is shifting and moving in new ways. And then back on Zoom in 2 weeks to talk more about religious trauma. And when the church is trauma, maybe we don't want to go back to these spaces anymore because of what's happened and what God might be saying to us in that. And then finally, when I see you in April, we'll talk about you kind of a take two. Now knowing what we know about trauma, how do we move forward? And as we did last week, we're going to start with a centering exercise. This is this one's called child relaxation. So it reminds me of my time as a pediatric chaplain and thinking about the children that we would provide care for. So sit however is comfortable for you. Maybe something worked for you last week that you hadn't tried before, or maybe you want to try something this week that you haven't tried. So if you feel safe enough to close your eyes or gaze your eyes in front of you, get comfortable. I'm going to ask you to relax. In a few minutes, I'm going to say some things that I hope will help you create a picture in your mind. I'm also going to ask you to relax different parts of your body. Learning to relax will help you cope with your anger, your sadness, and those scary feelings. So find a comfortable position in your chair, not touching anyone, and take a few relaxing breaths. Close your eyes and relax. Wiggle a little bit if you have to make yourself comfortable. All right, take a few more relaxing breaths. Breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. That's it. You're feeling peaceful. We're getting there. If you were angry when you started this, picture yourself moving from hot to cold on the thermometer, becoming more and more relaxed, cold, peaceful. Now, with your eyes closed, pretend that you are on a white, fluffy cloud high in the sky on a beautiful day. You are floating peacefully on that white, fluffy cloud, moving very slowly. You are as light as a feather. and the fluffy cloud holds you safely, floating across the sky. Now, as I count from 1 to 3, imagine that you are sinking deeper and deeper into that cloud. So the cloud is all around you. 1, 2, 3. You're now enjoying the ride on that cloud. Now, notice your toes and your feet, how relaxed they feel. Notice your legs. All the muscles in your legs are light and relaxed on the cloud. Notice your arms, your neck, your head. Now you are totally relaxed, floating on the white, fluffy cloud. Remember that you can return to your very own cloud whenever you feel like you need to calm down and relax. Whenever you need to cool off, move from hot to cool on the thermometer. Now we're getting ready to stop our ride on the cloud. We will stop on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Open your eyes and stretch a little. Wiggle if you have to as you come back to the room. So last week we ended talking about why does the history of trauma matter? This change from viewing trauma as a problem with the individual, as a weak individual, as somebody who is in their pathology, to moving to these experiences, these traumatic events happen to us, and then we respond to those. So then as this becomes a diagnosis in the DSM, trauma becomes this abnormal external things that happen to us beyond our control. And so we use this working definition from my colleague at Candler, Danielle Hansen, that it's a response to a highly distressing event or series of events that occurs in the life of an individual or community. Overwhelms one's capacity to cope, often because of a sense of threat to their lives and what is most meaningful to them. And so that talks about experiences, that these things that happen outside of us, and then we, depending on a myriad of reasons, experiences, adverse childhood experiences, the way we were raised, all these things then determine how we respond to these events. And I left you, and things felt pretty heavy. So there's this heaviness of, well, Josh, what are we supposed to do about this? If this is as prevalent as I say it is, and this exists with all of us, maybe you left last week with the sense of, this feels pretty heavy and it feels pretty raw. And I think that's right. I think that is absolutely where we are. But I think for us as a church, as followers of Jesus, that we are called to be there for people. We're called to walk with people as Jesus walks with them. And so trauma-informed care is this idea that the more we learn about trauma's after effects, the better prepared we are to recognize and respond to trauma survivors and victims appropriately by avoiding re-injury and facilitating healing. So you're going to leave these 5 weeks, you're not going to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist and have a legal pad to be able to diagnose, but we are going to be able to have a better sense of recognizing trauma and where it is in our people and doing the best we can to avoid re-injury and re-traumatization. This is trauma-informed care. We're noting the fragility of humans, the limits of our own cognition, and just to continue to try to be aware. So, what would be important for Fourth Presbyterian Church to do to promote trauma-informed care? Or what would be important for you all to continue to do to promote trauma-informed care? Because in many ways, I think you're already doing this work in very intentional ways. I'm going to start and end today with this piece. So Judith Herman in Trauma and Recovery, she talks about traumatic countertransference, which is just a fancy way of saying that trauma transmits horizontally. That for us as caregivers, as human beings in relationship, the more we take in stuff from people, it can impact us as well. So, secondary trauma, tertiary trauma, that for pastors and those who listen to these stories day in and day out, it can lead to similar symptoms in yourself: depression, anxiety, spiritual malaise, maybe even burnout. So, in the midst of all this, when it feels very external and feels like we're taking notes about how to care for others, I want us to remember, how are you caring for yourself? What are the things that work for you in your own self-care? How are you staying open to those who need your presence as you attend to your own limits? We all have limits. And for some of us, it's more difficult to acknowledge those limits, acknowledge that other people can help, but it doesn't have to just be me. It doesn't just have to be Josh. So there is a sense of self-care, the things you do by yourself, but I would hate for those things to be done only in isolation. But what are the ways that we as a community can care for one another? How do we show up for our friends at Fourth Pres? How do we show up for our friends in Greenville? How do we show up for our family members? And then, as heavy as this can feel, yes, that there is a sense where we experience this horizontally, but also there's a vicarious post-traumatic growth that as people grow, we that also transmits horizontally. And so for as heavy as this is, and as heavy as this will feel over the next, 4 weeks, there's also a sense that there is hope and there is healing. And I end with this slide, a pretty rhetorical question. Like when I am doing intro to pastoral care class, or I'm doing a trauma class to MDiv students who are thinking about going into ministry, and they're thinking, what do I need to do to be ready to be a pastor? How do I check the box? How do I have all these things compartmentalized? And my question always rhetorically, even though maybe my answer is implied, is can you ever really be prepared for the work? And for most of you, even if you're not pastors, those late night phone calls when you're like, I don't have any idea what I'm going to say to you, but you called me. You asked me to go to coffee. I was not prepared for this conversation. And so it's that heaviness and that reality of life and ministry that is guiding our conversation today. So what you see on the screen now are the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care starts after that history we mentioned last week. So moving from the 1980s and into the 1990s and then into the 21st century, it's, well, what can we do as different systems? What can we do as a high school, as a middle school? What can we do as social workers, as a hospital? And what can we do as a church to be trauma informed, to understand the impacts of trauma? So that first R, realize. That's that deep understanding of where we started last week, where we talked about trauma being everywhere, being ubiquitous, being this thing that is everywhere. And I threw some stats at you and I said that some estimates note that 66 to 85% of our youth report lifetime traumatic event exposure. And the point of the stat is not just to throw numbers at you, but it's to realize that your church members, those of you in the room right now, by rule, not by exception, have experienced traumatic events. And so my guiding assumption is that in some way, we're all trauma survivors. We have moved through things that have happened to us or around us. And so to realize that, I think gives us grace to think about others. So to effectively support those who've experienced trauma, it's essential to realize how trauma alters our psychological, our emotional, and our physiological responses. I think realizing this means acknowledging that trauma is, it's not just a background detail, like, oh yeah, this thing happened to me. But in some ways, for some people, it can be a central component that shapes their interactions and their behaviors. That we realize that this comes from various sources and has various impacts and effects. And we're holding all that intention as we move into the second R of recognize. Once again, you're not going to leave these series knowing everything, all the clusters of symptoms of trauma, but it's recognizing signs and symptoms that trauma might be going on. It gets us into the room, it gets us into the conversation, it gives us a hint of what might be going on. And last week I mentioned the at least for me, the quintessential example of recognition is thinking about Fourth of July's in veterans. And we think, doesn't the veteran know that they're not in Baghdad anymore? Don't they know that they're not in Vietnam anymore? That they're in Charlotte at a Fourth of July party, having a hot dog? It's like, yes, of course, they cognitively know that, but the recognition comes in knowing that the brain has adapted. And so these things that we see now, the fancy word, we'd say that there are these maladaptive behaviors. But at that Fourth of July prop, it becomes a misapplied skill. So the brain continues to do things that used to help it, but now it's kind of getting in the way of really coming back home. And so what the recognition is an awareness of how trauma can manifest, how it shows up, how it might show up in a Sunday morning service, how certain words might trigger people in a sermon, how certain curriculum without a trigger warning might hook people. And then there are these range of symptoms, right? Like anxiety, mood swings. Why does this person have a difficulty trusting me? I'm an authority figure. Why don't they trust me? But it's recognizing pieces of their story that have led them not to trust those in authority. So we're listening, and we'll talk a lot about listening today, listening to those subtle cues and nonverbal signals of what might be going on. Two more R's. Number three is respond. This is always the one where people are like, okay, Josh, what do I do? How do I actually do the work? How do I actually respond? How do I effectively address and support my congregants, my friends, me people in my small group? It feels like you're taking that realization and recognition and now you're ready to go. And what I want us to think about is responding appropriately involves creating a supportive environment that prioritizes safety. Safety is the bedrock of trauma-informed care. It's hard to heal when you don't feel safe, when you don't feel like your needs are being met, when you don't feel like you can trust those who are in community with you. So those responses, which we'll talk about today, a trauma-informed church would be empathic and validating, normalizing, acknowledging the impact of trauma without judgment or dismissal. And then finally, that big one, to resist re-traumatization. And that's moving from the question, what has happened to you, asking that question instead of what is wrong with you. In some ways, this feels heavy because it's saying, well, I don't want to re-traumatize anybody. How do I know what I'm saying in a sermon or what I'm saying in a curriculum on a Sunday morning is going to re-traumatize somebody? And there's grace here because you're probably going to do it. I know I've done it. But it's about building relationships, building safety, and building trust that when we do those things, we are trying to resist doing it. But that when we re-traumatize, that we are able to build those relationships with individuals that they can come back and continue to feel safe. So in many ways, it does feel like a high bar, but it's a high bar that I think is met with grace. And this is going to guide the rest of our time today. These six core principles of trauma-informed care. And this is, in many ways, this is what I see you all doing. Like when I was spending time with you last week, when I've been on your website, like learning about you, like Fourth Pres in many ways is doing this stuff. And in all six of these, if you think about the opposite of them is trauma. So we'll start with safety. The trauma is an experience that disrupts safety. And so what we want to do is establish safety or safer spaces, places where people feel like their needs are being met, ensuring our physical and emotional safety while protecting privacy and confidentiality. Trustworthiness and transparency. Here's where I see you all really shining. Because the opposite, if you spiritual abuse, spiritual trauma that we'll talk about is you have one leader and you can't question that leader. There's no transparency about how decisions are made. There's no understanding of like, if I don't agree with something, I can't say it here. But trustworthiness and transparency is you bring yourself to this community and you can hold it. And sometimes this can be just naming things on a website because that's the first place people often look in 2025. If you're new to a city and you're looking for an open and affirming congregation, as we would say in the United Church of Christ, you're looking for those little things on the website. You're looking for, is this a space that can hold my doubt? Is this a space that can hold my curiosity? So when you all talk about the details around not an oxymoron, be in a space that can hold all the abuse that has happened to the LGBT community, but we can talk about that in a grace-filled, loving way, moving forward to be an earth care congregation, to be a space that we can talk about deconstruction and how to come back. Like, we don't have all the answers, but we're going to kind of figure these things out. But there's transparency about moving forward. Peer support, connecting individuals with similar experiences. I mean, this is what the church is to me. That's kind of why I chuckle. It's showing up for one another. It's showing up and being the church, not just in those four walls, but in the greater community. Collaboration and mutuality. How do you all share in decision making? How do you reduce power imbalances between leadership in the church? Like, how are decisions made and who gets to make those decisions? Empowerment, voice, and choice. Once again, the opposite of this is what happens in trauma. You had your voice taken away. These things happened to you that you didn't choose to do or didn't choose to have done to you. So when people are ready, a trauma-informed approach is providing avenues for making decisions and letting individuals make their own choices. To get that empowerment back is crucial for our healing. We help people leverage their strengths and preferences to empower them to take control of their recovery. And that last shape, whatever that shape is called, it's not really a pentagram, I guess, maybe. But cultural, historical, and gender. So it's it's addressing and respecting cultural and historical contexts that ensure that our spaces are inclusive and responsible. There's not one way to provide care for everybody, but we're open to the fact that care can look different for different people at different times. So what do I say? Josh, what in the world do I do? I think I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm just going to make it worse. I feel, analysis paralysis. I don't even know what I'm going to say. And what I want to say, my overarching pastoral care principle, I believe this in my bones that your presence is everything. That who you are to show up and listen, to show up and be with people as they're processing and moving through their trauma is everything. You're thinking, but I got to give them advice. I got to tell them the 5 steps to get back on the right road. They don't need your advice. And it's not your job to fix anything, but it is your job to show up, to listen, to assess what's going on, and then co-create. And what I mean by that is they are the one that does the work. They're the ones who are moving through their story, and we move alongside them. We help them. Maybe we bring other people into the conversation as well, but it's always a co-creation. It's that moves into our stages of recovery. So 1992, in Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, she offered those first three: safety, meaning making, and then reconnection, or what I call remembering, bringing our members back together. And then in 2023, she releases her second book, kind of as a follow-up of what she's been doing over the past, 30 years. And it's about justice, what trauma survivors want in the face of what's happened to them. So trauma and recovery, and then truth and repair. And the work is about integrating those traumatic experiences. As we mentioned last week, healing can also change how our brains are wired. So I want you to think, just for these 3 questions, what images does safety conjure for you? And think about what elements make one safer, and then what things or places makes you feel safe or safer. So safety is ground zero. The traumatic event involved, it was a lack of safety, right? What we talked about on the previous slide. The trauma interrupts the story of our lives. It halts us, it stops us. And eventually, like, you need to name that and tell that story. And the coping moves you through those things, but it's really impossible to do that healing work if a person's basic needs aren't met. Just think about the last time you were really hungry and you couldn't focus. Perhaps you were irritable, you're unable to make decisions. Maybe you're like my son and you were hangry. You just can't even focus. You're so mad. But once those basic needs are met, you come back to a sense of equilibrium. My point being is that it's hard to get much done when your body knows its basic needs aren't being met. So yes, we need to do the important work of meaning making and reconnection, but those things happen after we feel safe. It's like an ozone layer. I remember in the 90s, I'm showing my age maybe. Like I'd never heard of the ozone layer. And then this whole thing becomes this really big deal. Like with, I remember like Aquanet hairspray. Like we weren't using those kind of aerosol sprays anymore because they were damaging the ozone layer. And then like the ozone layer became this thing I heard about all the time. But I like to think of safety as an ozone layer. It protects us, it buffers, it's a support system. If you feel safe, you don't really have to think about your safety. Like you don't really think about the ozone. But when you feel unsafe, when there's been a threat, then you all of a sudden are thinking about those things. And so the question I'll ask throughout our time for the next 4 weeks is what can you all do as fourth pres to promote safety? So physical safety is one way. Do you feel safe in your body? And so the caregiving priority here is to ensure physical safety needs are met to the best of your ability. The best of your ability, right? What are the resources in your community to be able to help people um, who need food, who need shelter, who need someplace safe to go, right? Maybe it's not you, but you know those resources in your community. I'm gonna move through these skills here with you. I'll put them all on the screen as we move through it. So when I think about safety, it's thinking about empathy. You're thinking, Josh, I don't know how to be empathic. I haven't gone through this thing that so and so is bringing to me. And I would tell you that empathy is not always about same experience, it's about same emotion. Like, can you think about times when you've gone through something similar, when you have felt terrified, when you have felt a sense of rage, when you have felt lament deep in your soul? Yeah, maybe you haven't been through that exact experience, but you know a little bit about those emotions. And so we lead with a sense of curiosity. Are you curious? Like that's a such a big question for me is are you curious? I think a sense of curiosity helps us not need to solve everything. That's not the goal. But it's about showing up and being a trustworthy individual who listens. You resist the urge to try to fix it. Now, I know this next one is hard, but the gift of silence. What are they going to think if I don't say anything? What are they going to think? Do I not know what I'm doing? Do they think I'm not listening? Oh my gosh, oh my gosh. But I promise you, silence can be a gift. Silence can be a gift. When I talk about open-ended questions is the basis of co-creating new new goals, new healings. Because we asked a closed question, hey Josh, are you mad today? No. Stops the conversation. But asking an open-ended question opens up space to be able to have new conversation, new moments for meaning making. Validation. Friends, this work, even though it's heavy, even though it's raw, this is sacred work. And so we validate that if somebody has trusted you with their presence, they've trusted you with their story, we validate that. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for bringing this to me. It takes a lot of courage to even bring that up. Reframing non-judgmentally. When they bring forward maybe a complaint or it it's helpful to reframe those things as a strength. Because we get so down on ourselves. We get so down on the way we internalize our problems. But what would it look like just to kind of turn the aperture a little bit and tell the story in in a different way? So we have physical safety, then we have psychological safety. Do you feel safe to bring things up in meetings, in all those places? I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I know you all, because we've been doing a lot of them. We've been praying, we've been checking in, we've been breathing, we've been trying to ground ourselves. We did a little bit of wiggling earlier. And maybe when it's not raining, I encourage you, or with a good rain jacket, to go outside, walk around. Maybe there's things for you that look a little differently. And then spiritual safety. This is the crux of week 4, our lecture 4. When we talk about when the church is traumatizing, this is what we're talking about. Do you feel safe to be confident in your beliefs? And do you feel a safety to question what you hear, either from the pulpit or in a Sunday gathering, or even something I've said? So once we've built that sense of safety, we move into meaning making. We move into a space where we start to make sense of what it is that happened. So, what are some assumptions about the world that people have that trauma challenges? Trauma challenges the way we make sense of the world, our global meaning making. Like, I thought people were supposed to do this. I thought this was supposed to be a safe space. This was supposed to be the church. I can't believe they did that to my child, right? It challenges our assumptions, and then we have to make meaning off of that. And we do that through remembrance and through mourning. So I mentioned global meaning making, right? So that's that framework. It's like how we go through life. It's our lens, it's our spirituality, these things we think the world is supposed to be. A trauma pokes a hole in that. Trauma pokes a hole in the way we make sense of the world. And so what happens then in the traumatic like after effect is we got to like put things back together. Like, well, if this is true, but this happened, what next? How do we reconcile those differences? Then we have situational ways, and that's the things that poke the hole. Wait a second. If this is true, then what does this mean to my entire global meaning making session? And so, pastoral theologian Carrie Doring, she talks about moving from our embedded theologies to our deliberate theologies or deliberative theologies. And what she means by that are these things that we were raised with. God never gives you more than you can handle. Other embedded theologies can be I'm a minister. Nothing bad's supposed to happen to me. Like I'm on God's side here. Why am I going through this? Why did my child die? At least you have other healthy children at home, right? Like we say these things that come deep from our embedded theologies. And the goal is to move to deliberative ways of thinking about theology, what God's saying to us on the other side. Once again, we do that from listening, assessing, and co-creating. I'm going to finish on this slide. So we have about 5 minutes. Yes, I really am going to talk about listening. This is it. This is perhaps one of the most important things to me when I think about how people make meaning. People make meaning of their lives through stories. Telling stories is central to how we make meaning as people. That there's a radicality to listening to stories. This first dawned on me in a veteran context when these soldiers would come and tell me stories that they haven't told anybody else, that they were holding this shame, they were holding this sense of, I couldn't even tell my spouse this. I'm ashamed to hold my daughter when I got back from Afghanistan, right? But people make meaning. And if you are the one that gets to hear this story, it is incredibly sacred work. To be heard is healing. It's confirming, it's normalizing, and it emphasizes your very existence. for someone to listen to your story and help you make meaning through that. What I mean by this, it it kind of goes back to my flippant point a little bit ago that a caregiver, whether that's a pastor, just a human being in a relationship, listening to a story and providing care to a friend, you're a consultant. To not view yourself as whatever I tell you, I am the expert, I'm going to fix this. No, we're coming alongside our friends. We're coming alongside our congregants. We're coming alongside our friends as consultants, as co-journers in this world, not necessarily as experts. And it's with that that I think who has the rights? It's the person who's their story. They tell the story when they're ready. They tell the story and they can stop at any point. It is their story and they have the rights to it. Works to repair limiting and disabling dysfunctional stories. I think this can be hard for us. So there's multiple interpretations of a single narrative. If you talk to multiple people who are in a traumatic event, there's going to be multiple interpretations of that story, and that's okay. We show our empathy. We have these embodied listening. That's one way we can show empathy is through our listening. So realistic expectations. So like all relationships, not just church relationships, but relationships with loved ones, relationships with our family, relationships, sports teams, relationships take time. And if we're worried about solving somebody's traumatic event or traumatic experiences, my hope for you and reminder for you is to remember that relationships take time and that we continue to show up, we continue to care on their time with patience and with presence. Remember what I said a while ago that your presence is everything. I really do mean that. The storyteller, the person who's telling you the story, who might miss a couple weeks, but then they show back up and then they drop out of your life for a while, but remembering that they have the rights to tell their own story. Nobody has to narrate a story they're not ready to. And it's through our empathy and through our this trauma-informed awareness of knowing that we empathize the relationship and the connection. That's what matters. Not necessarily the parameters of like, am I solving this? Am I fixing this? And when people say, Josh, I still just feel like I don't even know how to start a conversation. I don't even know how to get into the room. I'm so stressed out. I feel anxious. And it starts with you. And I would say, just thinking and then even asking the question, like, how can I be supportive right now? How can I be useful? How can I be supportive of where we're going? So I said I would end with this slide. So as we go from here today, and as you go to worship and you go into the week, to take moments and take stock of how you're caring for yourself. How are you staying open to those who need your presence, even as you attend to your own limits? How are you caring for yourself? Friends, no can be a complete sentence. If someone asks you to do something, maybe not Mike, I mean, he's the pastor, right? You know, if Mike asks you to do something, no, I'm just kidding. Sometimes no can even be a complete sentence there. How are you caring for yourself? And it's with that heaviness, but remembering that God is with us, that as we go through Lent and we go through this season of preparation and thinking and holding all these things in tension, that yes, maybe we're not always ready or prepared for this work, but God is. And God has equipped us, and God will continue to equip us and sustain us as we do this work. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you. Thank you for another week to learn about your people, how we may be the church, how we may show up, how we hold these things. And God, we are reminded of your presence, that you go before us, that you surround us, you sustain us. I ask you to bless my friends in that room, their families, their friends. I look forward to seeing them next week. We pray for travel mercies, and we ask these things through your son's name. Amen.